Residential schools used to take the Indian out of the child. It was a way for the government to assimilate the First Nations into European culture, physically, culturally, and spiritually. Taken from their homes, separated from family, separated from the way they lived, the First Nations suffered over 100 years. This documentary will help bring an understanding of why it began, what went on at these schools, and what impact it has brought on First Nations and Canada in general to this very day. You are watching Canada's Past, A Shameful Truth. When the First Nations and the government made treaties to work together, one of the requirements the First Nations wanted was schools. These schools were wished upon to be on the reserves so that the First Nations could be taught the ways of the Europeans, but still have the beliefs, way, and customs they have always had. However, the government did not keep their end of the bargain, and had the residential schools placed in remote areas and run by several different Christian churches. Children were taken from their homes and taken to a residential school. They were separated by gender, given new clothes, and their hair was cut accordingly. The first thing they were told was, "Now you are no longer Indian." First Nations culture has a strong spiritual belief. At the time residential schools started, the government decided that it would be more appropriate to have the First Nations become attached to a better religion than not have any religion. Christianity would be the only religion tolerable in the schools. Churches such as the Roman Catholic and the Anglican Church were very important in the schools. Other important churches include the Methodists and the Presbyterians. Missionaries from various churches would become the teachers of schools. Students that attended residential schools had a lot of difficult issues to deal with. The education they received was more of copying and memorying. Since few teachers were available, they could only teach so much. They would make them copy and then study for a test without any application of the knowledge.
Ron Ignace. I remember even going to the priest and saying, "Look, Father, I really do want to learn, but my grades are getting worse and worse and worse. I don't know what to do."
The residential schools were home to some deadly diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, dysentery, and tuberculosis. With the government not supplying enough medical help, students and staff were left to help each other to fight the various flus. Sometimes, when a student died because of an illness, he or she was marked down as discharged, not deceased. Some parents were never even told what became of their children.
Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott, said that 50% of children who pass through these schools do not live to benefit from the education from which they have received.
Hunger was something that the students had to deal with every day. Each student's experience was different. For some students, the food was few, poorly made, and poorly kept. Others had food that tasted well, that gave energy, and they also had variety of foods. The schools were supposed to be self-sufficient, but if the workers, who were the older students, were hungry, then it was hard for them to do the work to farm.
John P. Ace remembered, walking past the staff dining hall and noticing they have steak and chicken. It looked like a king's feast. All we had was bologna sandwiches.
Student labor was something that the residential schools needed in order to survive. With the half-day systems, students would be part of school activities in the morning. In the afternoon, they would work. The schools would use the older students for the manual labor that the younger students couldn't handle. Some schools would even compete for older students. However, these students worked long hours, oftentimes never going to school for the day. The skills that they were learning weren't helping them at all.
Rita Joe explains how working in the kitchen was. You had to get up at 4 in the morning. We'd bake bread, and oh my God, every second day we'd bake for 35 to 40 loaves. Holy Lord! And we made a soup in a huge pot. It was very high and very round. We'd make porridge in the morning in the big porridge pot, and we'd boil over 200 eggs. It was a lot of hard work that we did in the kitchen, and the cook could be cruel.
Students had to obey all the rules imposed, and any disobeyers would be punished. For example, if a student were to lie, not fix their incorrect work, and run away, they would get the strap. Rulers and pointers were used often. Students weren't allowed to talk to each other, so they weren't able to comfort each other. Some people have said that the discipline was far too extreme, as that kind of discipline would not be tolerated in a white school.
Simon Baker and his friends ran away from the Leighton School in British Columbia after witnessing his friends being beaten with a leather strap. Maybe he did a naughty thing, but he should have never gotten a licking like that.
Many students would be subject to physical and sexual abuse. Those who were to take care of them would not be taking proper care of these students. Some students would be touched inappropriately by the nuns and or principal. Not that all teachers and principals did this, but abuse from them was not uncommon throughout the years. These incidents would leave the students even more confused and extremely scared, as they had no place for them to feel safe.
Rita Ari was told that when a well-liked priest had been grabbing her and rubbing up against her when he passed by, that it was just his way.
However, not all experiences of the residential school system were bad. When the schools had sports or other recreational activities, students had something to enjoy. Sometimes going to the residential school was a way to escape problems from home. Some have even learned well from these schools and have gone back to those schools to teach, or have even become part of the church. Even though this number of experiences is positive, it's still a small part of the system.
Andrew Amos recalled about the school. The treatment was good as long as you excelled in sports.
If it wasn't for the continuing effort to resist this system, the residential schools would not have been a failure as it was. Parents and children alike were determined to avoid the schools. Many students hid when an Indian agent came to their reserve. Parents would lie about their children to protect them. Many students, at any chance they got, ran away from the schools back to their homes, so they could be with their family. If it wasn't for these people, the First Nation populace would have a different appearance.
Mabel James's grandfather sent her to the woods when the plane came to her community to collect the students. He sent me to hide in the woods. He told the Indian agent I wasn't home, which was true. I was hiding in a hollow stump. I waited until the plane left.
First Nations weren't the only people to be sent to these schools. It was first thought that Métis would be the bridge between First Nation and European people, to be the moderator between disputes. However, that never did seem to work out when the government did not want Métis to go to these schools because it cost too much money to put them through. Up in the north, Inuit children would be sent long kilometers away from their homes to go to residential schools. Hostels were usually made for the students to dwell at to go to school. The teachers who worked at these schools suffered just like the students did. They worked long hours with low pay. Just like the students, they did not get holidays. They had to live in the unsanitary conditions that the students did as well. These teachers saw that they could make a difference by teaching class and preaching sermons. They worked diligently and creatively to do the job that was set in front of them. The nuns, as they were called, usually didn't stay for many years. Some only stayed for 1 year, while others stayed for 3 or 4. Each teacher was different, so how they felt towards First Nation differed between teachers. Some teachers had made friendships with former students they taught, while others had been remembered in a more negative aspect. Some teachers even quit their jobs because they felt the treatment of the students was not right. The churches always had to hire teachers for the short demand. Near the end of the system, First Nations who have come back as teachers were making a real contribution and making the system better before its complete shutdown in 1998. In the 1990s, former students began coming forward about the abuses and experiences they encountered while in the system. Soon, several groups were formed for the sake of the residential school legacy and the impact it had on First Nations. On June 11, 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper gave a formal apology on behalf of the government and Canada itself to all students who attended the schools. The Prime Minister had acknowledged that the system was to assimilate First Nations into European culture by taking children from their homes. Harper was joined by other party leaders in a historic moment in Canadian history. The problems that were caused by the school system still needs to be tackled. Poverty, high suicide rates, and substance abuse can all come back to the legacy of the residential schools. As Canadians, we must come together as one to heal each other. Our past may be painful to look back upon, but the future is in our grasp. Let us seize it now and work together for a new relationship with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. This is our story. Let's make it a good story to tell.